I mean, I think it goes without saying, but over half of the startups in Silicon Valley are started by immigrants, and so we should expect to see a similar dynamic here if we really want to have a strong innovation ecosystem.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave.
Hey, Jeremy, did you stay up late watching the results?
No, I went to sleep obviously looking at the results, and at the time, obviously, the sample count had come up. The counts were pretty solid in terms of the trend, but definitely had to wake up to the morning for the final counts because I think they made those final announcements at like 2, 3, 4 a.m. And I'm getting old, maybe.
So, when you woke up this morning, was that sort of in line with your expectations? Were there any specific results that surprised you? Where were you betting on things?
Yeah, I woke up surprised, I would say, and also after like maybe like a few minutes, maybe less surprised. I would say the part that was surprising, of course, was that I think talking to like me friends, colleagues, I think there was a sense that if the consensus bet would have been that I think the PAP would have less of a vote share compared to the last election, but that PAP will continue to defend all of its seats. So I think because of the first past the post system where, you have to be the number one winner of that district in order to get those seats. So I think that was the sense. And I think that the fact that the PAP outperformed by beating analyst expectations of it going below 60% to actually increasing its vote share to 66%, I think was a surprise for many folks.
Yeah.
How about you, Shiyan? Yeah.
I mean, I think we've seen a global trend, right, which is that instability favors incumbents, right? So whether it's Canada with Mark Carney or Australia, who actually voted on the same day as we did, I think that perhaps is not as much of a surprise. I did think that, in WP wards where they're taking share, actually, so even in Tampines where they lost, they still swung the vote share by quite a large amount. And so that's an interesting sort of result to me, which is that for places where the Workers' Party has been more entrenched, their management of the town council, the familiarity, them seeing their MPs walking around continues to build trust amongst their constituents. And, I think they're emerging as the most credible and organized opposition party, right? I think the other thing is that I think like 10 plus parties contested, but everyone else lost their deposit except the independents.
I think it's interesting because I think it's definitely fair to say that there was a sense that the quality of the candidates had improved for the Workers' Party, I think especially. I think less, I guess so, for the other political parties. I think what's interesting is that there's definitely been a sense that the quality of candidates has actually improved for the Workers' Party. I think a lot of my peers were impressed, by several candidates that came up. Obviously, there was Michael Thung, who was an ex-ACS student. I think he was a junior of mine, so I've known him for a while. And he studied at Harvard Kennedy School in Boston. And then he had previously spent many years at Boston Consulting Group. So I think that was one candidate. There was another candidate, obviously, was Andre Lau. He was also a Boston Consulting Group work experience. And then he did his MBA in INSEAD. So I think these were candidates that were of the millennial generation that come across as like serious corporate experience and have gone to good universities, right? Which is an interesting bar, but that's how people think about it is, hey, the quality of candidates seems to have gone up. And these would historically would have been PAP candidates because of that corporate and public sector experience. So I thought it was an interesting dynamic there. How about you? What do you think, Shiyan?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, I think historically the sentiment amongst professionals has been like, why bother? Like, it's a suicide mission. The fact that the Workers' Party is able to recruit beyond, I guess, the traditional sort of lawyer class, expand into corporate and some entrepreneurial folks as well, I think is a great sign for the strength of their brand. And also, I wonder if I mean, I guess it's an interesting question. Would those people ever have hit the PAP's bar? Or, you know, I mean, I think probably, you're sort of making the argument that these are candidates that the PAP would have been happy to field, given sort of the strength of their credentials. But, you know, is it that the PAP, like, isn't looking for folks who have views too different from theirs, right? Historically, I think the PAP has co opted folks and brought them in house, right? Expanded the tent. So I think that's pretty interesting actually. And I think there's also the woman whom they had represent the Workers' Party at the Chinese Roundtable as well. She's ex MFA.
Yeah. I think there's actually quite a few ex-civil servants actually in the Workers' Party, actually, which is also quite an interesting pickup because, yeah, I think it's, I don't know, what's the word? I wouldn't say that they would have hit the PAP bar, but I'm just saying that I think it's perceived that those were the personas that would have represented the People's Action Party from a Reddit perspective or from a man on the street perspective. I'm just saying, hey, that's a great place to get like people's like deep views, right? Or they're very. So I think it's been interesting to see what that strategy continues to be. So I think what's interesting actually talking about it is that I think, to be fair, it's not just about the macros and stuff like that. I think the People's Action Party has, I think, come across with the fourth generation. I think Lawrence Wong, he has done, I think, a great job, I think, communicating the message. I had the opportunity to tune into the Yalla Butt podcast with Lawrence Wong. It was about an hour plus, and I thought he did a fantastic job on the podcast. He came across as just like a normal person who cared about Singapore and had some thoughtful thinking about how the policies work out. And he acknowledged that there were like things that the party could have done better. And I remember I watched a whole hour and I was thinking to myself, and I was like, this guy needs to do 3 hours, Trump style. But I think the longer format actually really, I think from my perspective, I think humanize the PAP a lot more than I think their format is not really like the rallies, maybe. The podcasts, they seem to be doing well. And I actually watch a few more podcasts of other PAP ministers and they do well in that, I don't know, small group, conversational format. I don't know. So that's my point of view.
You're saying please stop the TikTok videos, right?
Like I said, Lawrence Wong, in previous podcast, Valerie Vu said that Lawrence Wong did really well on TikTok in Vietnam. Clearly, it's working for some people. Lawrence Wong also did that speech, right? I think where he was like addressing the trade war by dynamics on a global basis, and then that went viral on Twitter. And then I was getting like messages back from Americans saying, "Wow, a Singapore Prime Minister does such a great job explaining the Trump tariffs." And I was like, "Wow, I don't know. I don't think he should stop. I think he needs to go multi-channel." Yeah.
No, I agree with you. I think long form benefits like more nuanced discussion, right? Which actually they
Yeah.
are. I mean, I think, our technocrats are more than capable of. I think the TikTok stuff can just sometimes feel a bit cringe.
I think if you find it cringe, you're probably not on TikTok, right? If you're on TikTok,
Whoa,
you probably find it
whoa.
normal.
So now you're just saying I'm old.
I'm calling you old,
Yeah.
Shiyan, 100%. Yeah, I mean, I think also there was a big macro effect, I think for sure. So I think we saw that in Canada, like you said, we saw it in Australia. I think that voters actually rewarded people who felt like they were economically competent or had a very strong, I think, foreign policy and global macroeconomic experience. And I think that the Singapore's opposition was very much focused on cost of living, I would say, and domestic policy as kind of a key focus area as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is bread and butter issues at the end of the day, right? That's what elections tend to be fought on. And so, that's I think that makes sense, right? That's the average citizen does not have a lot of control over what's happening with like US foreign policy, right? So they only have interaction over like, oh, can I afford an HDB flat? What is the impact of GST? All of these sorts of things. So, I mean, I think that makes a ton of sense. I went to a WP rally, by the way, and a lot of the conversation was focused on senior
Ooh.
citizens. No, I think it was
Mm.
very personable, I would say. And I had time to go to a PAP rally. I wanted to go to both just to have the contrast. But, went
Mm.
to a WP one and really well attended, it's the spectrum on age, young people, old people, race. Yeah, they were very natural, I thought, in connecting with the crowd and chat. And Sylvia Lim spent a lot of time talking about senior citizen policies and how about young people. And, seniors are the ones who built Singapore. And so, what are some specific things that we can do to help improve their quality of life? So, yeah, I mean, it was like pretty thoughtful and not particularly rabble rousing. I guess I didn't really know what to expect. I've been to a rally before, and you could just see people being like quite engaged. But it was in the stronghold. It was in the east, you know. So I think they had people who are actually residents as well, like me from the west.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting because I think that kind of goes to the next stage, which is really about policy, right? And obviously, we think about it from two lenses, right? What is the impact on business and tech in Singapore and Southeast Asia? Obviously, we think about it from the other side, which is from the persona of business and techie folks as in the space. How do we see policies, right? Which is, I think, one is from a change of policy perspective, and the other one is more from an identity perspective. I think from a policy perspective, obviously, I think that the People's Action Party has been in power since 1965. At least at a surface value, it seems like this election basically seems to be a mandate, right, to continue those policies from the PAP perspective. Obviously, that changes and so forth. But obviously, since it wasn't like a vote decrease, and since the PAP continues to have a super majority of the seats, so I think it could be viewed that the policies will continue to be the status quo, but with some changes. Do you think that's fair, Shiyan, or do you think what do you think is happening?
I think that's fair. I mean, I think the key things that the tech business community cares about are immigration, right? And sort of the ability to bring in talent. I think there's sort of like employment policies. So whether it's like, you know, parental leave, working parents, things like that, that impacts sort of like your costs. You know, no one really talks about research funding, but I think that's like another thing as Singapore's trying to make a big push into like deep tech. I think that's something like the business community would be interested in consider. And then I think the last one is around like venues for liquidity, right? So the reform of SGX and whether that will continue. But it's pretty wonky, and none of the is actually really addressed any on those last couple points in their manifestos. I think there's fair amount of coverage on immigration policy, and some parties did cover employment policies, but not really on research funding or liquidity venues. So I mean, I think it's probably more of the same. I think immigration did not seem to be as big an issue in this election cycle as in 2011. And so hopefully that means that there's not a lot of change to, the ability for people to come here and start companies or folks to be able to continue building their teams as needed, regardless of where they originated from. So, I mean, I think it goes without saying, but, over half of the startups in Silicon Valley are started by immigrants. And so, we should expect to see a similar dynamic here if we really want to have a strong innovation ecosystem.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I think that the immigration policy is probably the status quo, which is, I think, focusing on higher educated, more talented immigration or capital inflows as well. So I think there's a big push and I think a bit of a difference across the past set of immigration policies as well. So I think it's going to be interesting to see that happen. I think the other aspect is that I think all the wonky stuff generally, yeah, nobody else really covered. I'll say maybe education is one of those topics that you and I have always been passionate about from our personal experience. Obviously, I think the status quo will continue to some extent. Obviously, some minor tweaks along here and there. So yeah.
I mean, that one is an area I have some concern, right? Which is, I think that is continuing to advance. And so how will the education policy respond to that? I'm sure someone's thinking it, but I think the question is like, will changes be made quickly enough in order, to respond, right? So whether it's like, and we talked about this, right? For recent grads, I don't know what you're going to do for them, but for all the people in school right now, are we equipping them with the right set of skills and experiences to thrive in a world where there will be more and more sort of automation, and not just in like robots for manufacturing, but also for desk jobs?
I agree with you. And I believe the only candidate to speak really about AI automation was the independent candidate, Jeremy Tan. So he calls himself Encik Bitcoin, meaning Mr. in Malay, but I think in the Army National Service, I think it is pretty much a warrant officer. So I don't know how he got his name Encik. Call himself, was he a warrant officer in the Singapore military? I really doubt it, but correct me if I'm wrong. And then he calls himself Encik Bitcoin. So I thought it was a catchy name, obviously. But I actually met a few friends who were turned off by that name because they're very skeptical about Bitcoin. But at least, I think he might be the only candidate with a nickname like that. I don't know. I can't think of anybody else who had a nickname.
Well, yeah, nicknames cut both ways, right? They can be memorable or they can pigeonhole you. If you actually look at his
Okay, maybe he's
website,
the only guy who would label his own nickname.
yeah, but if you look at his website, right, which is actually quite well researched, I have to say, like you actually can get a sense of him, and I don't agree with his Bitcoin. But in his education section, he does talk about like AI and the impact and, how it pertains to some of his recommendations. So, I mean, I think it's something that is going to be a bigger and bigger topic going forward, and maybe the government doesn't want to scare people, but there is going to be like a huge change in how work is done, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jeremy Tan did well. He got 36% of the vote, right? Which was pretty good for a newcomer independent. So I think he outperformed many of the smaller parties as well outside the Dub Workers' Party. So I think it's been interesting to see him do that. Maybe we should talk about, I think, maybe his persona, and then we'll also talk about his policies. I think what's interesting is that, of course, in terms of persona, he's definitely a tech person, right? Based on obviously his LinkedIn profile, his track record in terms of startups and investing in startups. I think his attire, where he was like wearing all black during the rally
He's just
to
you,
speak.
Jeremy.
Wow, thanks. I actually gotten that comment twice now about how he is. It's because it's the same name, Jeremy, right? We're both in tech, and I tend to wear dark colors as well. Sure, shoot me. But I thought it was interesting. So I thought it was definitely, I think he showed up in his website, right? I think he was talking about his policies, and then he subdivided them into multiple categories. I thought it was an interesting spread of policies that he had. Do you want to talk about his website, Ashian?
I mean, I think it was like really like nicely laid out. You can actually get a sense of it's not like a talking points kind of play. You don't. It feels like a normal person talking. It doesn't feel like some sort of highfalutin language, and it's laid out by different policy sections. There is a Bitcoin section, but there's also housing, education, and all the sort of requisite transport, consumer, political recommendations. I think like it's actually well researched. It actually shows someone who's like trying. And I watched part of
Mm,
his rally on YouTube, and he seemed like a very personable, kind of like actually trying, done a bunch of research guy. So I think it's. I feel like the Singapore of our youth would not have produced this sort of candidate, right? And yeah, so it's like really refreshing to see folks come out and try. And
yeah.
he made a funny comment, right? He was like, "Oh, some PAP person's like, who's this Jeremy Tan? I've never heard of him before." And then he's like, "Well, yeah, who's my opponent? I've never heard of her before either." Like, he's just like a regular person. So I think that in a place that tends to somehow like put people's credentials kind of on a pedestal, like I think it was refreshing to have someone come through and sort of be like, "Hey, I have like ideas, I've done research, I care about this, and I'm gonna run. I don't need like validation from
Yeah.
a party or anything." I thought it was kind of neat.
Yeah, I think so. And let's maybe talk about some of his policies at a high level. I thought the part where I think you disagree probably is the part where he says we need to invest CPF into Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think.
So I think that's his headline message.
Yeah, and I think he made a lot of money on Bitcoin, and that's good for him if he can personally withstand that volatility. But I think as a national policy for people, that feels very risky. And so, yeah, I don't advocate that.
You don't want your 80-year-old auntie to experience Bitcoin going up 30, 40% swings.
No, I don't. I
Yeah, it sounds like a nightmare to communicate.
Yeah, and I think also there's this sort of like it almost feels like good policy should be boring, right? It should work and it should be boring and it should not be exciting. And I think crypto is too volatile for most the average person, right? And at the end of the day, if it doesn't perform, then what? The government is still left holding the bag. So, yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
pretty challenging. But don't let that I think take away from some of the other recommendations which are like not crazy. And there was one questionable one. I don't know. He's wants to do a study on the effects of fluoride in water. That feels a bit too RFK-ish for me.
I didn't see that one.
It's in the consumer section. But I did think, he had some interesting ideas about how to reduce scams, whether it's like, having digital advertisements be verified by CorpPass or doing a two-factor authentication for government bodies to help protect, you know, vulnerable sections of the population from being preyed on by scammers over the phone. So, yeah, like it's creative. Someone's like thinking out of the
Yeah.
box, proposing things. We
Yeah.
should encourage more of that.
I didn't notice the fluoride one. Yeah, maybe we will invite him next time and I'll have a debate about the fluoride issue, the CPF. But I would say that one thing that's true is that I think obviously they're catchy pieces, right? So I think the CPF Bitcoin is a catchy thing. I think obviously for people who are into crypto, obviously would see him as probably the first ever pro crypto candidate in Singapore's history. So I think obviously it's a great way to activate a crypto group. That's one. Two is a lot of young people, Gen Z people hold crypto. If you teach at university, like is easily a quarter to a third of people hold some form of crypto. So I think it's a good way to get some of that Gen Z vote, I would say. But of course, I think when you flip it outside, obviously I have other friends who are turned off by crypto statement. So I think it's as a tool to get visibility. I'm sympathetic to it. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that policy changes over time on the crypto side.
I don't think CPF is adding crypto. I don't think that policy will change. But yes,
I think it's
you'll get
yeah, I
exposure
think it's
to it
an interesting one.
through Temasek or GIC investing in like, blue chip crypto infra companies. That's how you're going to get your exposure.
Ooh, that'll be an interesting component calculation to make, which is hey, for the average Singaporean, what percentage are they exposed to crypto currently as part of and divide it across all the various investment verticals, right? That'll be interesting analysis to see what the implicit asset allocation and yield would be. I'm sure someone has that number, but that's interesting to hear. Actually, one interesting thing that also came out of this is talking about this entire landscape, like who's happy, who's unhappy, what will change. I think that's because I think whenever we say the status quo, more of the same, obviously for whom it benefits today, then obviously people are going to be like, okay, that's good. But obviously there are going to be people who are unhappy about the results. And obviously I think the People's Action Party will continue to, I think, triangulate, right, and work towards it as well. Yeah. When you think about the next 4 years, what do you hope things will actually get addressed? I think one of them is education, right?
Yeah. 5 years. You're not an American. I think education, I think, is an important one. I do think that they need to solve the housing HDB question. Those are probably top of mind for me. I think a more systemic question is probably like, how do you incorporate more voices and allow people to bring more different ideas to the table? Even as people have voted for the incumbent, and I mean, I guess you could say the last two elections were like crisis moments, right? So first, the last one was during COVID, and this one is kind of in the middle of the Trump tariff trade war, which obviously has a big impact on Singapore. Like, people are still handing the mandate back to the incumbent, but how do you, continue to give people room to express their concerns and frustrations and not get to a point where people are like, I just want to flip the table, right? Because I think that's very
Yeah.
dangerous. So the sort of redistricting didn't sit well with a lot of people. So yeah. How about you? What do
Yeah.
you hope gets addressed in the next 5 years, Jeremy?
I think the topic for everybody, zooming out from my perspective, is that I think there is a recession coming for Singapore. And the net effect, obviously, of the Trump slash Republican administration debate on its trade relationship with China and the world, I think is a fair, obviously, domestic issue from the perspective of America. It's just that for Singapore, it's such an existential dynamic, right? Where the ports are a function of the trade, right, between the East and the West. The airports, right, is also a function of that same logistics channel. I just think that there's a recession coming fundamentally. There's really a slowdown that's already been projected. Obviously, maybe there's some off ramps, right, for how China and America deal with this issue, and maybe the impact is not so bad. But I think that's really like the crux of it. And I think the question you got to ask yourself is this rewriting of the East and West, right, relationship, is this like a 4 year thing, right? Or is this a 40-year cycle? Because if you're saying that it's a 4 year thing, then Singapore's economic model doesn't have to change in terms of its ports, logistics, and so forth. If it's more systemic, right, as a 40-year cycle that we're seeing here, then I think that's a serious headwinds, right, for the Singapore economy. So I think some serious thinking needs to be done And we never really got that conversation going. Obviously, a lot of this is like new and happening live. But I think there's going to be a serious debate over the next 4 years, which is like, if this is true, then what do we do? And I think that's like I would say there's a more fundamental debate, because I think if you make an argument that East and West trade, let's say, goes to zero, I'm just an example, right? I'm not saying that's true. If you make that on a spectrum, you go all the way to one end and say it goes to zero, then using that hypothetical, then what kind of industries? And is it like Singapore's focus on homegrown entrepreneurship, capital, immigration, but moving away from a trade perspective, but more from an innovation perspective? I think that could be one argument that you make. The other one you can make is that it goes to the services, which is not a different answer, but it's a different set of answers. So it could be a Venn diagram. You can do multiple of these things. But I think all I'm just trying to say is I think there's a bit of a fundamental rewrite of the economy that's potentially in play. And I think that's difficult, like you said, maybe a bit too wonkish discussion, but I think that's going to be something that's top of mind.
Well, it's not a discussion you can have in a 9-day campaign period, right? So that's like you can't just drop
You create this
people.
flow
You
chart and
can't
then you
just
put
drop
this.
people into that conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I'm just saying that this is something that will happen. I think that has to happen over the next 4 years. I think because I think we're going to find out next 4 years whether again this is a temporary thing or is this a structural, systematic change.
Well, how many days are we into the 90-day renegotiation of all the trade agreements again? I think we're.
I've lost track of the time windows and all this other stuff. Yeah, I think it'll be an interesting debate that will be had. But on that note, I think this is a good way to wrap things up. I'll see you next time, Shiyan.
Sounds good, Jeremy. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.